Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today is a little different than normal. No Alex, no Jess, but I am joined by Becky McCabe. She and her family serve in West Africa, part of the CMA. But I'm not going to do as good a job of telling everyone what you do because I feel like you've got your hands in a lot of different things.
Okay.
Go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners and let them know who you are, a little bit about your family and what you do.
Yeah, okay. So since 2004, my husband and I have been serving with the Christian Missionary Alliance in West Africa. We serve with CAMA Services, Compassion and Mercy Associates. It's the relief and development arm of the Christian Missionary Alliance. So I am a humanitarian worker. I really have a strong value to work in the context of poverty and really improve the quality of life for the people that we serve. But I'm a Jesus-loving humanitarian, so I really recognize that the gospel has to be at the heart of our efforts. And so my husband and I have been serving in the last 20 years in West Africa, just discipling people living in crippling poverty and watching Jesus transform their lives. More recently, or I guess in the last 10 years, we've served in a leadership role for CAMA Services. So it's just we oversee all of our workers and our work for CAMA Services in Africa.
Okay.
So,
all right. Awesome.
yeah.
And just to kind of preface things as we go into this conversation, for people listening who may not understand certain terms, you described CAMA very well. People know what that is. One thing that we might refer to is a TCK. That's something that I'm sure people could Google, but go ahead and explain what that means to someone who hasn't heard it.
So it used to be MK, missionary kid, but now with the word missionary just kind of has a negative connotation sometimes. It's third culture kid. And so it's just anybody that's grown up in a country that's not their passport country, the passport that they hold. So I'm an American, but I was born in Burkina Faso and spent most of my life in Africa. So I'm a third culture kid. And then what was the other one?
The other one, Hands of Honor, is something that's going to come up.
So yes, that is a ministry I'm very passionate about that I started about 10 years ago in partnership with our local churches. And it's Hands of Honor. It's HOH, but Hands of Honor. And it's a ministry, an anti-trafficking ministry, anti-child labor ministry.
And you said that's something you started? Or?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago. Just really, so if you look at inequality and injustice in the lives of women and girls in West Africa, the nonprofit Save the Children did a lot of research, and of the 144 countries they analyzed, like the best and worst places in the world to be born a girl, Gold Kingdom, Mali, where our family was serving, came in as the third worst country in the world. And so I just got tired of the inequality and injustice in the lives of teen girls that I was working with, and so we began this ministry. And it's really, we just provide a safe place in our community through our local churches for child laborers, because they're the most vulnerable to sexual exploitation and trafficking. And so sub-Saharan Africa has the highest percentage of child labor in the world. So just in the context of poverty, parents can't afford to take care of all their kids or educate all their kids. And so when they get around the age of 12, 13, they'll put them into the workforce. And so they're just very vulnerable as maids, living on their own in a big city. And so our ministry really provides a safe place. And then there's an education component, gospel component to it, and just a lot of skill sets, vocational skills training that we provide as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another note, I guess, for our listeners is if they haven't been listening to the podcast for a long time, they could go back to episode 35 and they could see you and your husband. This was right before the pandemic, about 3 years ago. But if they want to meet Sean, there's an opportunity for them to do that.
He's wonderful, so they would want to meet him.
Okay. All right. Let's dive into this a little bit. Okay. I'm excited to hear. I think so many times we can be, armchair missionaries, I guess, over in the West and think we have it all put together or whatever and have our own ideas. But if you bring such perspective that I think is just invaluable because you have first person perspective. You've been there. You've done the work. You know what it means. You know the cost, the sacrifice that you've had to make. Now, when we mentioned TCK or third culture kid, what were some of the challenges with that? Because I think you growing up with that perspective has been beneficial to what you do now, but I'm sure it wasn't always a walk in the park. Yeah.
So my generation of third culture kid experienced boarding schools in elementary. I don't think that's kind of a passe thing that we don't do anymore. And I think I'm thankful for that. But my experience, so I went to boarding school when I was 7. And that was just the only option in our generation that our parents had for education for their kids. Homeschooling wasn't aware of that at that point. There weren't international schools that we have now. And so that was really, like, if I look at my parents' generation, the sacrifices that they made for the gospel are humbling. Like, I think our generation of missionaries were even a little bit entitled, and we want our creature comforts, and we don't want to have to pay the cost to follow Jesus on mission. And I think that generation really paid it. But yeah, so I went to boarding school at 7. I went to up through high school. I had a great experience. Like, I think, there's trauma, there's things that I went through that I've had to deal with. But
so boarding school being wherever your parents were, or was they would send you away?
Yeah, so it was an International Christian Academy in Ivory Coast, and it was just the boarding school that I think it was first grade through 12th grade.
So how often were you seeing your parents then when you, in that scenario?
So I was lucky because my parents in Burkina, they're only probably about maybe an 8-hour drive. And so I saw them about every 3 weeks, maybe every month. I saw them for a weekend.
But still, for a kid. I just think of my own kids. Like, that's a long time to not see them.
We had dorm parents. So if I look back on some of the most influential people in my life, it would have been my dorm parents. They really had a significant impact on my life. But so there were challenges to being a TCK. But you also had a different worldview, a different perspective. And the Lord really used it, just some of those experiences really to call me to the mission field as well.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier that you and your husband are leading in CAMA right now. Yeah. What perspective on the state of global missions, particularly in Africa, and what changes have you observed in the past decade? Like, because I think that's something that, your childhood probably gives you one perspective, but now that you've been leading, you've been on the, boots on the ground, what 10 years, how's that changed for you? And you've gone through a pandemic. There's so much there.
Yeah. I think we're seeing more resistance to the gospel. Like, I feel like even 20 years ago when I was a missionary, if I was sitting on a plane next to someone, I could say, hey, they ask what you do. I'm a missionary. Now I say I work for a faith-based nonprofit because I feel like there's just a negative connotation to it. And so there just really is this, like, there's more of a perception of the colonial era and the, the oppressiveness of the West on some of our African countries. And so, so I see, and also resistance to the gospel. I feel like a lot of the people groups that were animistic, that were really receptive to the gospel, those people groups have been reached. And now we're working primarily in really strongholds with a lot of Islamic or Muslim peoples that are harder to reach. And so my dad and his generation would go out and show the Jesus film, and you'd have whole villages come to faith. We realize now that we really have to have a meaningful, impactful presence in a community. We've really got to have we need a hybrid worker. We need somebody who really has that training in missiology and theology, really has a brokenness for the lost, recognizes the gospel is the heart of what we're doing, but also recognizes that we need to reach the needs of the whole person. Like, we need to take the full gospel. I think so often, even our first years with the idea of the gospel is, okay, just pray this prayer of salvation. You're going to go spend eternity. Jesus came, if Jesus came just to save us from our sins and we spend eternity in heaven. And we don't address the realities that people face in this world, the brokenness in relationships and suffering and poverty. And so we're just giving them a narrow perspective of the gospel. And I really feel like to reach the remaining unreached peoples in this world, which are the poor. If you look at the 1040 window, with the remaining unreached peoples of the world, they are the poor. That's where we have the hot spots of conflict in the world and crises in the world and poverty in the world. So we need to be Jesus came to do so much more. He came to set us free, to bring the kingdom now. I think perspective is important in our communities. So our workers need to be hybrid. They need to really have that missiology training and really have a church planting, a heart to see the church established. But at the same time, in order to reach into a community, they have to be ready to come to serve them with a meaningful, impactful presence.
And so when you briefly, maybe just you use the term 1040 window, just describe that to someone who's maybe never heard that before. Okay. What would that mean? Yeah, so
I hope I can explain right. But it's basically it stretches across the world, and it's a 1040 window. And if you look at within that regions of the world, those are where the most unreached peoples are, the people that don't have yet access to the gospel.
Gotcha.
But if you look at that same window within the perspective of poverty, that's where all the poor in the world are also in those regions.
You mentioned that you said that the poor are the most unreceptive. Is that what you said to the gospel currently, or is that?
Well, I wouldn't. So in the context as unreceptive, I would say people of like
The
Islamic
Muslim
faith.
oh, Islamic faith. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
but a lot of them are also the poor. So I think it's just we need to, in the perspective of taking the full gospel, we need to go in the context of poverty and really just say Jesus cares about your living conditions. Jesus cares about the brokenness in your relationships. Jesus, it's not just this idea that Jesus just came to save you from your. I mean, it's a huge, it's an important piece of it, and it is a piece of it for their eternal salvation. But what about their reality now? Like, if I go in and say to my friend Ami, who lives in a slum community, single mom, just has had a really difficult life, and I say, just pray this prayer and your sins will be forgiven and you spend eternity in heaven. It's a pretty hopeless gospel, because does that gospel address the needs that she has in her life right now? Like, what about her reality today? And so I feel like if, we need to, the gospel, and we need to be addressing and caring just like Jesus did about the things in her world, the difficulties in her life right now.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I think is that, you think the Islamic faith, is it that you find a lot of those people, their faith is so strong that makes it challenging for them to hear this other gospel being taught to them? Or is it, because what they believe, what they've studied, they probably know of Jesus, at least he's in the Quran. So like, is that what the challenge is a lot of times, or is it just a cultural thing, a barrier there?
So the culture is so wrapped up in their faith and their Islam. So all of their holidays, all of their celebrations, the way they do marriages, just their, your family is your support network. You don't have life insurance. You don't have health insurance. Your family is like, if you have a medical crisis, it's your family that's going to help you out. So people who make that decision to follow Jesus are ostracized from their community, from this. It's such a collective society. It's not so when you make that decision, you're ostracized from your community, from your family. And so there's a huge cost to pay in following Jesus in our context. And so that's where we'll have a lot of people who know that it's the truth, like Jesus has revealed himself to them in a powerful way. But then to make that step publicly, to say, hey, I want to follow. Like, so in our churches, you can't take communion until you've been baptized, because it's such a step of faith to say publicly that, hey, I'm following Jesus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's a different reality. Like, I think here you can tell people, hey, I've decided to, I'm a Christian now. And they're like, oh, okay. In our context, you say that, and you've been abandoned by your entire support network.
So they're not just making, on the Western culture, we make this big deal about that. I don't know. It is a big deal, and I don't mean to dismiss that, but it seems a little simpler, because it's like, proclaim Jesus as your savior. Yeah. Yay, let's celebrate. Yeah. Where here they may be able to proclaim that, but then they're making a huge decision that's painful and scary and all of that. You know? Okay. Yeah, I think that's really powerful for people to understand and have that perspective.
We had a gal in our Hands of Honor program that came to faith a couple years ago, Dana. God got hold of her heart, did a powerful work. She just became this like evangelist, just wanted to share this good news that she'd had, and how Jesus had transformed her life. And she really wanted to share it with her family. She's from a very unreached. There's just a couple dozen people, they believe, in her people group that follow Jesus. She's from the northern part of Mali, but her father's a very devout Muslim. And so when he found out that she put her faith in Jesus, he threatened her life, disowned her, kicked her out of the house with just clothes on her back. We were really even worried for her safety and had to move her to another city. So that's the reality for people. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about Hands of Honor and the work that they're doing. I know you're addressing an injustice that's happening with inequality and dealing with vulnerable teen girls in Africa. Do you see that as kind of something completely separate, or is that it's still working obviously towards the same goal, but you're probably dealing with teen girls who are in the Islamic faith as well, but do you handle that differently? Is that a different approach, or?
No. So when girls are in our program, we have 6 different locations in 2 countries in West Africa. We have 121 participants. I would say 98% of our participants are Muslim. We have some Catholics, a few evangelical Protestants in our program, but so we're just very honest. Our staff are all believers. Most of our program is facilitated out of local churches, so we just use the facilities of the local church. So they know, their employers know that they're coming to a Christian program. We've had employers and parents that enroll them just say, hey, I'm on board with teaching them to read and write. I'm on board with teaching them a vocational skill set, but I'm not opposed to any Christian teaching, but we
wow.
just have to be honest. That's what we're about. So we use a orality program. So most of our girls are illiterate. So it's a story set of stories from Genesis to Revelation that just kind of shares God's plan of salvation. A lot of the stories are stories of women that had encounters with Jesus. That's so powerful for them, because I think in the Islamic faith, women and children, I don't know if I can say this on this, but women and children are devalued in Islamic faith. And so there's just something that draws them to Jesus when they see how much he valued and loved women. So we have this story set. We've had girls come to faith in our program. All of them are exposed to the gospel. All of them have, without a shadow of a doubt, understand what Jesus came by the end of the time that they're in our program.
So how many years has Hands of Honor been in operation?
Yeah, so it'll be 10 years this spring.
Okay.
Probably the fall is when we started our new program year, but all of our paperwork and everything was in the spring.
Do you have any, even if it's just one story of someone who's maybe gone through a majority of that, or been maybe at the beginning and you've kind of seen their trajectory or anything like that? Yeah,
so probably a more recent story. I'll just change her name, but is Sarah. So she was grew up in a poor family in Mali. So when she was 12 years old, her parents put her into the workforce. Poverty just forced them to do that. They put her in a Muslim home. Her employers, when she was 16, heard about our program and just saw value in it. And they're one of the ones that were opposed to Christian teaching. But she really developed a very close relationship with our group leader, Naima. She's an Alliance pastor's wife. But she had really severe migraines. And so there is a piece of a lot of, especially in West Africa, we see traditional Islam. So there's a mix of animistic beliefs in there. So there's a strong belief in Islam for the afterlife, for their eternal salvation. But in their day-to-day physical world, they still very strongly believe in the power of evil spirits and the demonic world for their physical needs.
Okay.
So when Sarah developed probably migraines, they sewed fetishes in her hair just to ward off the evil spirits, to keep, hopefully to help with the migraines. So Naima, just when she saw those fetishes in her hair, just really encouraged her, said, you don't have that. Those fetishes hold no power. Especially when you're at our center, Jesus is here, and he's more powerful. There's such a fear factor in their animistic. They're so fearful, and she says you don't need to fear. Jesus is more powerful than any kind of demonic. He's So she finished our program this last August, and at the graduation ceremony, they get our girls, because they're in a vocational track for tailoring. Yeah. She got a free sewing machine and then her license to start her own business.
Wow.
And so the graduates were given an opportunity to share, if they wanted to share a few words with people there. And she got up and she shared. She said, the first Christians I've ever met were the Hands of Honor staff. And she said, I can say today that I know Christians are wonderful people. She said, the best gift I got in this program wasn't this new sewing machine today, she said, but was the Christian teaching, which really surprised all of us. But she said she shared that in the 3 years that she was in our program, every time she would step on our property and she had a headache, it would just go away. And she would just feel this peace come over her. So she hasn't made a decision to follow Jesus yet, but she's continuing to be discipled by Naima. They meet together regularly. She's asking a lot of good questions, asking for some prayer.
Yeah.
And we just really believe she's on her way to making a decision. So that's kind of what we've seen over and over again over the last 10 years in different lives of our girls.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. What I'm gonna ask you just lean in just a little more.
Sorry.
When you're no, you're fine. It's easy to forget that.
Sorry,
the microphone is intimidating.
Yes.
When I hear you talk about how these girls maybe for the first time are hearing someone say how much they're valued.
Yeah.
What does that look like for the organization, or even just the mission work that you're doing broader than Hands of Honor, to incorporate their voices in bringing that perspective to others as you try to, it's not always not really a sales pitch, but it's some way. How can you? Is there a way to use that to help them share their testimony and let their voices be heard? Because I'm sure that the girl that grows up going through that program and has a changed life is going to be a lot more valuable than this white lady telling them why they should go to hear it from them. So is that something that you're able to do, or incorporate their voices?
So a lot of my work in the early years of Hands of Honor was just training our local staff, just really helping our local churches to see the value of women. Child labor was really common in our local churches. Nobody blinks an eye. So it was just, there's a piece of education and advocacy. And so I loved it. When I first started the program, it was just really frustrating for me even to see my own staff, the way they treated their child laborers. Like they all had live-in maids. Like it was just so common, And it would just be like, how are these women helping me with this when this is how they treat the issues like child marriage, female genital mutilation, all these different things that we address. They didn't blink. It was just so common. It was part of culture. But probably about 5, maybe 7 years ago, we had a couple instances where I just saw our staff become like these mama bears, and they saw the injustice in the girls' lives, and they wanted to do something about it. So like this last year, if I don't have all, I won't share it all, but if I could give you a list of all the child marriages that we prevented in our program, like staff just stepping in with parents and saying, this girl is too young. You cannot force her into this marriage. We had infanticide is huge in our culture. It's the number one reason that girls are in prison, because they either abandon or murder their newborn babies because there adds teen pregnancy. Yeah. And this last year, 3 babies were saved through our program that probably would have been abandoned by the girls, but they got support from our program. So sometimes I struggle. I don't think I'm going to see, we won't see the change that we want to see in this generation, of girls. But I think the work has started, and I have hope for their daughters. If I look at, 80% of girls in our context are circumcised. That's already happened to them. Mm-hmm. But I have hope for their daughters that they're not going to do that same practice with their daughters. They might be forced into an arranged marriage, but I have hope that they're not going to force their daughters into an arranged marriage. So change takes time. Changing culture, that's decades. That doesn't happen overnight.
It's not going to happen in 10 years. Yeah. And I think that kind of leads into my next question, and that's with anytime you have aid work or anything, missions work or anything like that, I think the question comes up of sustainability. And is that, how do you guys work through that? And are you thinking, you have acknowledged this is going to be decades. This isn't going to be a decade of change, and you're not going to be there always. Yeah. How do you see that working out in the future? And is it sustainable?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I feel like that's probably one of the most important questions, because you get donor fatigue. You get people they want to go on to the next big, more engaging ministry. And so I think one thing that's really helped with the Hands of Honor is we have kept, it's under $10,000 to run our program. We keep our staff get our compensated for their time. They get less probably than what most of us get in a day. They get in a month, but it does, it's helpful for them in their income. But and then we use our churches, so there's not a lot of overhead. So I think keeping the cost small. But I've really struggled over the years with this, because in development, sustainability is huge. We've got, that's got to be, anytime we start any kind of project, we want to start small and grow. Yeah. But I just also feel biblically, where's our command to care for the orphan and the widow? You know what I mean? And these girls are never going to be able to afford the cost of the benefits that they get through our program. And so I struggle a little bit, is this a benevolent ministry? Because I just feel like we're always going to have to be putting some funds in. The challenge now is to get our local churches in Mali on board, because they provide, you can use their facilities for free, so there is some buy-in in that way. But I would love to see our local churches see, hey, this is a value to really reach and care for vulnerable demographic in our community, and we're going to put it in our budget to compensate women in our church to be a part of this ministry. Oh yeah, it would be great if that happened, but our churches are pretty poor, so funds are limited. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and how do you? I guess when you talk about this stuff and you have this we have this Western perspective. Do you feel that a lot of misconceptions get kind of perpetuated by Westerners when it comes to poverty in Africa? Because and this is my own naiveness, I guess, but I think growing up, you'd hear Africa and you think that's one country. That's that's, you know what I mean? That's,
you speak African.
Yeah, that's our just different thoughts. You'd look at a map and say, there's that continent. Yeah, that's the country of Africa, right? Yeah. And I think when people visit Africa, there are parts of that continent that aren't in poverty. They have, they have thriving cities, and it looks a lot like the West in different ways. But there are just misconceptions that get, I think, perpetuated on both sides of that. So how do you kind of help educate people in a a way that's like, okay, you know, you don't have to roll your eyes a bunch, but.
Yeah. So I think something that really is difficult for me to see sometimes when people come is they have this idea that the poor in Africa have no dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And like, man, I've seen people at Walmart
yeah, right,
coming in their pajamas. You know what I mean? You see some of the context of poverty in the States and people unkept homes, like just not a lot of.
We televise it. It's called Hoarders, on TLC. There's a whole television shows devoted to it.
Man, like I look at I see these mamas that have dirt floors in their homes, and they wash their kids, like scrub them every day with soap, and like when they go out of their home, they always make sure they're wearing clean clothes. Like they're not like, it's not like they don't have any dignity because they're poor. Yeah, I think too, like, you know, so often we think, oh, we have to come in and meet all their needs. Like, you know, they have no resources, and we're the ones, you know, we're
almost
their
like they have no
saviors.
autonomy
We're their white
on their
saviors.
own.
Yeah. And I feel like we use a lot of asset-based community development, ABCD. And so it's really the idea of going into a community and saying, hey, you've got people in this community with these skill sets. Like, you know, this is awesome. Or you've got this, you know, asset that you're not utilizing. Like, let's partner together and you bring what you have to this picture. We did a nutrition program in a slum community a couple years ago, and we had met with the community, all the leaders, and we said, what's a need in this community? And they identified malnutrition. And so we did this malnutrition, you know, tested all the kids 0 to 5 that were malnourished, put them in this program. And we said, okay, what can you guys bring to this ministry, to this project? And so they provided the building, they provided the people to volunteer, they provided some of the fire, the gas bottle we needed to cook the porridge for the students. So there was it was like, hey, we're helping our own community. It's just not these outsiders coming in and helping all of our kids in this community. And man, we saw within 6 months, all those kids hit their target weight. And then they identified education as the next, you know, need in that community. 42% of kids in Senegal drop out. They have to take this test in 6th grade in order to go into higher, like upper grades, and 42% drop out. Especially in a slum community where you can't pay for a tutor, you can't send your kid to private school. Most of them drop out. So the same thing with the community. They're like, what do you guys have to bring to this? Like, we're just not, you know. And so it does provide like they realize, hey, we have our own resources to address some of our own needs. Yeah. So if you can, I think sometimes we miss that perspective from the West. We just come in and we think, oh, we're going to come in with all the answers and all the resources.
Solve it.
Yeah, but
there's one aspect of that you still see companies. I think Tom's shoes were one of the biggest, and it's like, hey, if you buy a pair of shoes, we're going to give a pair of shoes to someone who needs it. And I've heard stories where in certain parts of or different countries in Africa, it almost disrupted their economy a little bit. Like there's people there selling shoes.
Went out.
they need to sell those shoes. Is that also kind of in that same vein of misconception of what's going on there? And is it more beneficial for me to get involved and understand an organization like CAMA and how I can help there than, I bought a shoe and now I feel like I've kind of am admonished of my guilt or whatever.
So I think sometimes it's not a lack of resources, but it's a lack of how to use those resources in a way that really helps people. So I would say do your homework and really find an organization that's doing like asset-based community development, has a strong component of doing development in a healthy way. Because, you know, really development, like if you even look like when we were in college, there weren't degree programs in community development. There weren't really degree programs in working in the context of poverty. That's really like in the last 50 years that's really developed. It's like I guess a field, you would say. So I feel like we're getting better and better at figuring out how to do, you know, aid and relief and development in healthier ways. But yeah, I think it is important to, there's people that are doing it well and there's people that aren't doing it so well, and figuring out how to do that. But yeah, I think sometimes it's not that, we need to figure out how to use the resources that we have in a healthy way.
Okay. So it's not necessarily that these organizations are bad that are doing this like buy one, give one sort of thing, but it's just maybe if you really are compassionate about helping, there's probably a better way to get involved. Yeah. Right.
People always want to have like a hands-on approach, you know, like give clothes and it's great ways to do that. But sometimes too, like it's not the boring way. You know what I mean? We just need money sometimes.
Yeah. Like this is plain and simple.
You know, we don't need shoes. Just give us the money that you paid to buy those shoes. Like,
Yeah.
so I think sometimes that's our frustration because people want a tangible way. They don't want to just write a check. And so I
Right.
think sometimes we have to get creative in figuring out how can we use this desire to help people, actually, in a healthy way. So.
And while we're on the topic of perception, one of those things we've seen recently is the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's covered all over the news media because it's the hot issue, And I know before we started recording, you'd mentioned how there's a disparity there of the coverage of humanitarian crisis. And what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah. So it's been something that it's kind of been thinking about lately because we are in like a huge crisis in West Africa. Like our food insecurity is out of this world. By 2025, they say 60% of Africa won't be able to meet their food needs. So we've got in Burkina right now 42,000 people on the brink of starvation.
Is that because of the land is unable to be farmed, or is it other water? Or
we're in a terrorism. So we've got terrorism across West Africa. So we've got IDPs. We've got 22 million people that are internally displaced peoples. Wow. So they're not refugees. Refugees leave their country of origin. IDPs just have to leave their home, their village, and then they land somewhere within their country. So it's just been it's the fastest growing humanitarian crisis in the world, but you would never know about it in the news. Like Burkina Faso is. What's going on there is just heartbreaking. 30% increase in children going to medical facilities in these countries with wasting, which means that they've had stunted growth because they haven't had enough nutrition in the early, when they're really born up through age 3. So that's just the kind of the reality we're seeing. And so I just see all this, and then I think even our organization, we raise $1.5 million for Ukraine, and then you put out pleas for food insecurity and people who are on the brink of famine and starvation, and you're getting dollars trickling in. And I read this article that said that the incident with Chris Rock and Will Smith at the Oscars got 3 times more media articles written about that than all the humanitarian crises that we had in Africa in that same year. I had a stat here in 2022, the 10 CARE International reports the world's top 10 most overlooked humanitarian crises each year. In 2022, all 10 were in Africa. So we just see a disparity and just visibility of crises that we're having in Africa. And I just kind of wonder why sometimes. Is it? I can see Ukraine, they were attacked. It wasn't their fault. And I feel sometimes there's this perception that Africa brings it on themselves. And I just don't think that's fair sometimes because I don't think that's really the reality.
I won't go as far to say racism, but I will say prejudice. Do you think that plays a role in that somewhere where there are people of a certain
I think
race,
there is some truth. Some truth. It's easier, we can relate better with a Ukrainian, European, Caucasian demographic of people and I think Africa's always had this perception, so it's harder. And I think there's even more, there's even with Ukrainian, even the perception of them and helping them is different, than the perception of helping, the poor Africans.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose that in some ways America more easily rallies behind the idea of, okay, we want the team to win, right? Let's support the team to win, kind of, and and I think we've almost been desensitized to it. I think of growing up and just seeing late night TV ads with Sally Struthers and whoever else, just showing poor African kids with the flies and everything else. And it's just there's an image burned into our heads of what that is.
Not the reality.
But I also wonder if because of that desensitization, we think, someone's handling that. Yeah. We've been talking about that for years. Yes. I'm sure it's handled. It's fine, but obviously it's not.
No.
Okay. I'm going to maybe kind of pivot a little bit into some of just have you address some of the criticisms we hear in the West, or people talking about why American or Christian or white missionaries are doing more harm than good, and how you'd address some of that. One of those things that I've heard recently is sometimes Christians will go into an area and bring the gospel, and it's great, but then the way they do it maybe isn't very culturally sensitive, and so then they leave this mark where people think being a Jesus follower is a very Western way, they wear
Yeah.
skinny jeans and tattoos and piercings
Yeah.
and things that maybe aren't culturally acceptable, and they think, oh, that's what
Yeah.
the way Jesus would want them to be, or
Yeah.
something like that. Is that really a concern, or is that kind of just a very small portion of missions work that happens and things like that happen?
Yeah.
And or is it overall people are pretty cautious about the way they engage with the culture around them and bring Jesus?
Yeah. So I think I read I can't remember the name of it. It was like a cultural IQ. And I think we've come a long way in like recognizing that there is a cultural IQ, like there is a good right way and a wrong way to engage in a culture, and understanding a culture and engaging in a healthy way. So I feel like even in missions, we've come a long way from, like, I was just looking, you all did your 100-year celebration for Molly, and I'm looking at some of the pictures of the missionaries were wearing shorts. I'm like, oh my word, that's so culturally inappropriate.
Yeah.
So we've come, like, you know what I mean? So we've come a long way. And I think too, just contextualizing, like I work a lot in the field of mental health. And so I just like, I can't bring in mental health concepts and principles. Like I can bring biblical, but a lot of that needs to, what's biblical and what's cultural is what I address a lot in my context. And so what needs to change in this community that isn't biblical, but what's cultural that can stay cultural. Like, there's a real beauty in the way that women and wives are submissive to their husbands. I think that we have a lot to learn from the West in relationships, and married relationships in West Africa. Like, I think it's beautiful the way that they really respect their husbands. And I think the husbands could love their wives a little bit more. That needs to change. But we don't need it, I don't want to create a bunch of feminists, but at the same time, there are cultural things, that aren't biblical. And so that's where I really wrestle, like what's in the context of missions too, like where do we address things that,
Well, and there's a fusing of practices that happens, and we're not aware of it in the West because it's just, this is a Christian practice, and it's like, well, maybe that's more of a Western thing, and you're bringing that over there, and you're maybe unintentionally conveying that, no, to follow Jesus, you have to adopt this Western practice when really we want to convey the Christian practices.
It's got, like, so if you look at the old songbooks, they're basically our Western hymns written in, like, my favorite is Old Lang Syne is the offering song. So whenever they do an offering, they'd play Old Lang Syne. Like, I mean, not the words, but they use the lyric or the melody for it. So it's so funny. But now
we should adopt that.
But now it's beautiful. Like they're writing, like there's a gal that I was sharing about, Dana, that came to faith. She's a vocalist. Like God has just given her this gift, and she's writing worship songs in her language, the first that we know of. But they're within their own like musical style and everything. And she's not adopting hymns, and that's so. Yeah, I think it's changed a little bit, and ownership of their own faith as well.
Another thing that I think maybe prevents some people from engaging in this is the politicization of certain terms. Yeah. And I think mission work it's innately tied to social justice. Yeah. But then when you hear the word social justice, I know the hair raised on some people's backs right now, when I said that. And how do we fight that perception? How do we not confuse that with our faith? And because I think we're at least in the West, we've been going through this for probably forever, but it feels like it's so much more now where everything is mixed. Yeah. Our faith and our politics are so confused. And when you're fighting for something that is justice, how do you talk to people who maybe have a barrier up when they hear that? Yeah.
So I think I see both. I can go both ways because, like the work we do as humanitarians is really engaging to this generation. Like IMB, the Baptists, did a really great study on like this generation of, future generation of workers. And they really found that most of them, they were on board with evangelism, but they wanted to have like a meaning, like some sort of practical way that they're helping. They wanted to help a community. So I don't want, like when we look at recruiting for CAMA, I don't want a bunch of humanitarians like that just want to address social justice needs, because I don't think that the heart of the gospel has to be at the way that we're addressing. Like the gospel is most effective when it's addressing people's physical, spiritual, and emotional needs. So social justice, like I mean, you look at Jesus's ministry. I mean, he was a social justice advocate. Like that was a lot of his ministry, but the gospel has to be at the heart of it. So we don't want. So it makes me sad that, like, I have to be careful when I get up and speak that I don't just want people to think that all we care about are social justice needs. I want people to really understand that the gospel has to be at the heart of it. Because I used to have a boss for CAMA, and he would say, why would we spend, a lifetime helping people improve their quality of life here on earth just to spend an eternity in hell? You know what I mean? And so I think there's that. Yeah. So I love that there's more engagement. I love that I'm getting people applying for CAMA who have a brokenness for injustice in this world. We need people to care.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to understand the solution isn't, better programs, better money, advocacy for them. The solution is Jesus to those problems.
Which I think you're seeing a shift towards secular humanitarian organizations that is growing, where they're rejecting the gospel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not part of their organization.
Yeah.
But do you think the motivations behind that type of missions work is good, or can you at least, I don't want to say this inaccurately, but I'm thinking can you, and not parlay it, but you know what I mean? There's interest there.
Yeah.
But it's almost like they're saying missions work as we used to do it with the Jesus part. That's not really relevant today.
Yeah.
And how do you work alongside that? And because they're probably doing some good work still.
Yeah.
But
so I'll be honest, even with our own denomination, so CAMA, we used to, for our requirements for people, is they had to have so many hours of Bible classes. They really had to have training in missiology and cross-cultural studies. Those were all requirements. And so now CAMA's just kind of been lumped into the vocational track, which is great. We need vocational workers on the field, but their requirements are less. And I just feel man, that's a slippery slope, because we can get a whole bunch of people who just want to help people, but don't recognize that Jesus is the answer, and know how to share their faith. Our evangelists recognize that it's demonstration and proclamation, those, it's both. And I think so far, I feel we have this pendulum. When my parents went to the field, they weren't even allowed to drive someone to the hospital, that was in a medical crisis, if they were using a mission vehicle, because they were not about demonstration. We weren't about deed. We're about proclamation. That's all that, missionaries do. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So my parents were countercultural as, when they went to the field, they really, they fought an uphill battle for really caring for people's physical needs. But now I feel we could go the other way, and we're just going to get a bunch of humanitarians that just want to help people and don't recognize, and they're missing that proclamation piece. So, or they don't know how to do the proclamation piece. It's not that they don't care, but they've just,
it's been devalued. You'd say, at least.
Yeah, it's not so I do a lot of recruiting, and I ask people, when's the last time you shared your faith? At your workplace, how many conversations do you have about Jesus? You could be helping this friend who's, depressed or, struggling with anxiety, and you're helping them talk about those conversations. But how often do you bring Jesus into that conversation? That's kind of where I want to see both and calling from people. Yeah.
Can you share any challenges that you're facing? Maybe right now, maybe you've faced in the past, but what are just those real world things that people probably aren't thinking about, that is more of your day-to-day experience, and other people are going, okay, well, you're off doing missions work, but I'm sure it's fine. But what are the real challenges that you're facing?
I think one of them is sometimes we have, I shared a little bit, we have the resources, but to know how to really help people. I get in situations all the time where, it's hard. How do I help this person? I don't want to create dependency, so there's just working in the context of poverty. It's really challenging to know how to help. A really good book is Africa, Friends, and Money Matters. And it's a really good, understanding how is money, addressing. But so that's just one of the challenges, is always a challenge. So how do you really help people in the context of poverty? What's the solution? Education is huge. It's the number one factor of breaking cycles of poverty. So a lot of our work is focused on education. But so I think personnel, man, we need more workers for the harvest. The needs are huge. If you look at by 2030, 9 out of 10 of the poorest countries in the world are going to be in our region of West Africa. We need Jesus-loving humanitarians who know that Jesus is solution to poverty and people's needs. So, man, if we can get more workers for the harvest, that would be awesome. I I think just there has been a lot of change in missions and a lot of restructuring, even in our denomination, and how we hire, how we onboard, all those types of things. Like even learning languages, there was always a process for how we learn languages when we, moved into a community. There's just a lot of different challenges. Like, should people be learning French? Should they be learning the local language? Like, I don't know.
Well, and speaking of recruiting people to do the work, are you finding that this next generation are more apathetic to missions work, or maybe they're energized by the social justice side of it, but not the ministry side of it? Or because just in talking to older generations, sometimes they can be very loyal to their, donating to missions work. They understand why it's valuable. They get it. But even someone in the Western culture, they are cut from a cloth that they could go do that work, and they would want to do that. But if they're just the person who might not do the work but could donate, we don't really see a generation of donators right now. I don't know if that's the way to put it, but I don't think they're as energized by the idea of giving money towards things.
So I think I wish I had it with me, but I had read an article about like trends for donors and stuff, and like by Gen X or whatever, the millennial, all the different Gen Z or whatever,
Gen Alpha's the
and
really
it's
little
people
ones.
are giving, like it's not, but they're just giving to different things. And so even in our denomination, like we used to have the Great Commission Fund, so everything just came through this big fund.
Okay.
And now it's how do we say it? 2-part, 1-part message. So we have the GCF, so you can give to the GCF, and a significant portion of our support comes from the GCF. But we also have a pool now where people can give to us as individuals, and that has taken off. Like people want to give in the name of a person that they have a relationship with. And so I think just giving to missions is shifting. And how do we figure that? Like, how do we get people engaged in giving to missions still in a way that's appealing? So that would be one of the challenges.
Because I think we're seeing we're moving into a postmodern world, and it's a lot of moving. Before, in the postmodern world, it was about the head. How can we get people to think logically about this and go, okay, we need to do this because we have the facts laid out. But now it's much more of an emotional heart connection that people are drawn to. And so I think when you say they're more willing to give to a name, it's because like you were here Sundays sharing your story, and people hear that, and they want to help. What was a way that they could, if they wanted to help with your ministry, what's the best way for them to give?
So right now the GCF, because
is there a website or something?
Yeah. So if you just go to the Christian Missionary Alliance and just give it. So it's confusing to people because so much of our support is still given through the GCF, like maybe 40%. Great Commission Fund, yeah. So 40% of our needs are met through the ministry that people give to us specifically, but 60% is still given to the GCF, and it's at a significant, I think it's like $3 million.
Okay.
For Alliance missions itself deficit. So
the Alliance website's the best way. All right.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about a lot, and we probably need to wrap things up, but I would love to just hear if you have anything you're excited for, any vision that you have for the future of whether it's CAMA or Hands of Honor or anything else going on.
Yeah.
What's something that you could share that either you're excited about or you think others will be excited to hear?
Yeah, so I'm super excited for I think so. What's something that's really been encouraging to us? So I was talking about the food insecurity. God is bringing us new workers who they're calling themselves agricultural. They're doing agricultural missions. I'm like, what? I mean, they've labeled themselves that. Maybe it's a thing and I didn't know about it. But we got this couple come in. They worked with Peace Corps. He's he works for the U.S. What is it? The Department of Agriculture for the U.S. Yeah. Man, he's pastor to church in his part-time. He's just got this holistic piece.
Wow.
Yeah, gifting. We have another couple that's coming that's working in agriculture. So I just see God is before we even realized how significant the food insecurity crisis was in our region of the world, God was already providing these workers. And so we have, we really see an area for focuses in food insecurity, women's advocacy. And then we really see a focus on education because that's the key there is education to breaking cycles of poverty. So those are 3 areas that we really want to see CAMA grow in Africa. We'd love to have more personnel. We need more Jesus-loving humanitarians to help us address the needs in our community. So this year we're going to be gathering. Another thing we're seeing is we really need to be partnering with our local churches. We're not the solution. It needs to be our local churches figuring out the solution. So our Alliance World Fellowship has started a relief and development arm, which is so cool.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're going to be having a conference this year with all of our relief and development organizations in Africa with the Alliance, and just looking at these 3 areas, like how can we be working together, collaborating together to grow in these areas. So that's good. That's exciting to see. Our church is figuring out the solutions to their own needs in their community, and it not having to always be coming out from the West. So
wow,
yeah.
Awesome. That is exciting.
Yeah,
it's there's so many grim aspects to it. It's always a nice change to hear of where this is headed, and that there is innovation happening, and I think those things are going to always excite people. So that's great. Well, Becky, thank you so much. I know we've gone all over the place, covered a lot. Hopefully you feel like you've shared your heart well. We always appreciate it. And maybe in 3 years, we'll catch up with you again, and that'll be good.
I'd love that.
All right. Awesome. All right. If you're watching or listening and have any questions or concerns, you want to reach out to us, you can do that through email at our podcast at cccomaha.org, or you can reach out to us on social media on Instagram or TikTok at CCCOMA Podcast, or you can even leave us a voicemail. We love to hear from you that way. That's 402-885-9930. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.